Hey everyone, it's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, and today we're giving an overview of the Queen's Pawn opening. So the Queen's Pawn opening begins with 1 d4. White goes ahead and puts that Queen's Pawn out in the center of the board, and it's one of White's two most popular moves, the other one, of course, being the King's Pawn opening, and these two choices are so popular because they follow those opening principles very well. We all know that in the opening you want to fight for central space, which this move does very well, controlling some space here in the center. You want to open your pieces for development, which this move does as well. Two pieces get some open lines, and as well you want to castle. Now what's interesting is that in the King's Pawn opening, this move here, in my video on this, we saw that the nature of the game was very much dictated by Black's choice of his first move. Black had many different first moves here, most of them leading to completely distinct opening systems from each other. And that turns out to not be the case as much for the Queen's Pawn opening. Here both sides have a little more flexibility, and Black's system he chooses is not always defined by his first move. I'm going to show some examples in this video, and I think that has to do with the fact that the d-pawn is defended by the queen, and if Black chooses to put their pawn in the center, it will also be defended by their queen. So unlike in those King's Pawn openings, when those pawns come under threats very early and often, here, both sides have a little more flexibility because their central pawn has a natural defender. So I'm going to break our study of Queen's Pawn openings up into two broad categories. Number one, when Black does play the move d5, and number two, when Black does not play the move d5. So okay, let's get to it. Let's start by examining the very popular move here, d5. And it's easy to see why this move is popular. We talked about all the reasons that White's first move here is good, and if playing 1 d4 is good, then it stands to reason that d5 must also be good for the same reasons. Black kind of stands off against this pawn in the center, Black makes sure that they get their own share of central space, and Black opens some lines for their pieces to develop as well. Now against d5, White's most popular choice by far is to play the Queen's Gambit, this pawn sacrifice here playing c4 and fighting for even more central space. The Queen's Gambit is probably the most popular gambit in all of chess opening theory. You can tell by the name, Gambit, that it's a pawn sacrifice. Black can win a pawn here, but this is considered a very safe pawn sacrifice to make. It's very hard for Black to just take this pawn and hold on to it. It's not going to work out too well for them. So let's consider what happens if Black accepts the sacrifice and takes this pawn. Well, in exchange for a pawn, Black has given up their control of the center. This pawn was doing a good job controlling our e4 square, and it no longer does that. So White can either now or possibly later play the move e4 and take the whole center. And number two, we see that this extra pawn Black has is actually very weak. In fact, as soon as White moves the e-pawn, this pawn is already under attack by the bishop, and it's not easy at all for Black to hold on to this pawn, at least without making some major concessions and foregoing their piece development. For example, if Black plays the greedy b5 here, trying to hold on to this pawn, White can play the move a4 and try to undermine this whole pawn chain that Black is trying to set up. So once again, very difficult for Black to hold on to this extra pawn. So after c4, the Queen's Gambit, Black will often decline this pawn sacrifice and play a move like c6, just reinforcing their central pawn, or e6, reinforcing their central pawn. But if Black's not going to take this pawn, then it makes a lot of sense for White to put that pawn on c4. It helps fight for control over the center, and it's never going to be so easy for Black to just hold on to that extra pawn if they do decide to take that c4 pawn. And if Black doesn't take it in the next couple moves, White will probably eventually defend it somehow, maybe by playing e3 and letting the bishop defend this pawn, or else in some other way. So there's a high-level overview of why the Queen's Gambit is so popular for White, and again, we would probably need at least one whole video to really cover the intricacies of the Queen's Gambit itself, but let's look at White's other options in these Queen's Pawn openings. If White doesn't play c4 here against d5, then White usually plays what's called a system opening. And this is a unique feature to Queen's Pawn openings. Because this pawn is so well defended by the Queen, White has some opening systems here where White can kind of develop their pieces where they want them to go, really without regard to what Black is doing. Let's consider one that's called the London system. This is getting pretty popular. And White's just going to play knight f3, bishop f4, get that bishop outside the pawn chain before playing e3 and c3, putting all those pawns in dark squares, not creating any pawn tension, and then the light-squared bishop can develop, White can castle, this knight can come to d2, and really no matter what Black does, nothing can get in the way of White's setup. So let's take a look. Knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4. Let's say Black says, okay, you're not going to play c4, so I'm going to play c5 myself. Very common in these queen's pawn openings, by the way, for the c-pawn to get involved in the action, because it's pretty hard for the e-pawn to get involved in the central action. These squares tend to be very well controlled by the enemy pieces. And again, black's not really concerned about white taking this pawn, just like we saw in the queen's gambit. But white has no interest. White's just going to go along with their plan. Play e3, reinforce this guy. Let's say black plays knight c6, c3, e6, bishop d3, castle, knight d2, and we see white got their ideal setup. All the white pieces stand well, and now white can begin thinking of some kind of active operation like either playing knight e5 at some point, or in some lines white can play rook e1 and try to play e4 and grab some more central space. And this appeals to a lot of players, these system openings, because there's really not much to memorize. You don't have to worry about all the deviations your opponent can take. You pretty much get to play your favorite system no matter what your opponent does. Now, personally, I don't recommend that you play system openings. This is just my personal opinion, for two reasons. Number one, it kind of robs you of the ability to play many different kinds of positions. I think that's a very important part of your chess development, to learn how to play lots of different kinds of positions. And if you always play the same 8 moves to start the game, no matter what your opponent does, you're not really learning that skill. Secondly, it's just not a really ambitious path to take with white. White might get a slight advantage in some of these lines, but it's nothing like really putting pressure on your opponent with something like the Queen's Gambit, where you do get that space advantage. So that's my personal opinion on system openings. I think if you play d4 and your opponent plays d5, I would highly recommend playing the Queen's Gambit. And that was the London system I showed with bishop f4, but there's many of these. One is the Stonewall, where white plays c3, e3, and f4 very early on, getting this dark squared pawn structure, and then of course puts the knight on f3, the bishop on d3, all the normal developing moves. There's one called the Kali system, which is kind of like the London system, but without bringing this bishop out to f4 first. White can simply play e3 with a pretty similar setup. So those are some examples of a couple system openings. And by the way, remember what I said about how these systems aren't always defined by the initial moves? Let's say black plays a move like c6 here. If white plays c4, I would not consider this a system opening anymore. This is actually a line from the Queen's Gambit. This position you see here could be reached just as easily with d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, and e3. And we get what's called a transposition, right? 2 different move orders, exact same position. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about Queen's Pawn openings. These systems are mostly defined by their ideas and not necessarily by the specific move order you take to get there. And finally, within this d4, d5 category, I'll just briefly mention one alternative white has. If white's not going to play the Queen's Gambit and put that pawn on c4, and white's also not going to play a system opening and avoid any pawn tension at all, white does have a couple other options. For example, the Veresov attack with knight c3, where white sometimes intends to use this knight to support an early e4. This has never been too popular because it takes away the ability to get this c-pawn involved in the game, and after knight f6 you can't really safely play e4 anyways. Playing f3 and then e4 is always kind of risky. It exposes the king. Some players play e4 anyway as a pawn sacrifice. This is called the Blackmar-Deemer Gambit, with the idea that black can win a pawn, but white gets some open lines for the pieces. White wants to make use of the semi-open E and F file, and white gets this space advantage in lean development. But at the end of the day, a pawn is a pawn, and it's questionable if white really has enough compensation for a pawn to play this line. Certainly a lot of very aggressive players have played this, though, sometimes with great success. So if you like sacrificing material and getting an attack, you might want to consider the Blackmar-Deemer Gambit with knight c3 and e4. So okay, we covered all of the main options that can happen after black plays d5. We barely scratched the surface there on the Queen's Gambit. Again, that would probably need at least its own full video, probably multiple. That's one of the biggest opening systems in all of chess, the Queen's Gambit. But let's go back and talk about what happens if black does not play pawn to d5. So okay, if black's not going to play d5, their most popular move by far is to play knight f6, which makes a lot of sense. Black knows that this is the best square for the knight, they're getting closer to castling, and they take the e4 square under control, stopping white from getting the full center. So white will usually play c4 and grab some more space, since black has no pawn presence in the center right now. Again, white can play some system-like opening if they want, but let's consider the main lines right now, and let's say white plays c4. One of black's main options here is to play g6. This is the King's Indian defense. And we're going to see that black often gets to castle very fast, get this very compact structure here. This bishop not only helps protect the king, but also exerts a lot of pressure down this diagonal. It's true that white gets to take a lot of space in the center for the time being, but black will be ready to strike back later with either c5 or e5 depending on the circumstances. Going back here after d4, knight f6, c4, another very popular option here for black is to play e6, which often leads to the Nimzo-Indian defense. If white plays knight to c3, for example, black plays this move bishop b4, the Nimzo-Indian defense, threatening to wreck white's pawn structure and double their pawns by exchanging off for this knight. And also, of course, this stops white from playing e4 and grabbing the whole center like we just saw, because this knight is pinned. If white were to play this move, black could simply take this pawn, and white could not take back. After e6, white doesn't have to play knight c3 and let their knight get pinned, of course. They could play knight f3, for example, and now black has a couple other options. They can play bishop b4 check anyway, or black can play b6 and fianchetto on the queen side, controlling the e4 square even more, and this is called the Queen's Indian defense. And real quick, just to drive home the point about transpositions, after e6, knight c3, black could certainly play d5, but this isn't a unique opening system. We simply ended up right back in the Queen's Gambit. This position could occur after d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6. Another example that it's the general setup that really matters when we're categorizing these queen's pawn openings, not necessarily the specific move order. Finally, after d4, knight f6, c4, black sometimes plays the Benoni defense, here with c5. Black's threatening to exchange one of their flank pawns off for white's central pawns, which could be desirable for black. And as is very common in these queen's pawn openings, black's not really concerned that white's going to take this pawn. Again, it would be very hard for white to hold on to this in the long term. As soon as black moves the e-pawn, for example, the bishop's open on the pawn, the queen can try to recapture that pawn, and it's not so easy for white to hold on to their extra material. So the most popular response here for white to c5 is to push past and grab a space advantage like this, and this often leads to some pretty double-edged games. White can play like knight c3 and e4 in some lines, trying to get a big center. Black sometimes succeeds in striking back on the queen side where they've staked out some space, either with a slow plan like playing a6 and b5, or there's some lines where black can even play b5 as a pawn sacrifice to destabilize the white center, after that c-pawn goes away. So that's the Benoni defense, playing d4, knight f6, c4, and c5. Those are all the main possibilities of what can happen after d4, knight f6. I did forget to mention some little sidelines. For example, I'll just show one more. c4, there is this pawn sacrifice here, e5. This is called the Budapest Gambit, and it looks pretty crazy at first. Black's just freely giving away one of their central pawns, but it can sometimes not be easy for white to hold on to this pawn. Black can attack this pawn many times with knight c6 and queen e7, and black has some ideas there to win the pawn back, and has some traps white can fall into as well if white's not careful. I don't think there's any top-tier players who play this regularly, but I've seen some very strong players, super grandmasters, spring this out as a surprise weapon from time to time, playing this pawn sacrifice e5, the Budapest Gambit. So we covered all the main lines that can happen after knight f6, but black has a couple other options. They don't have to play knight f6 if they want to avoid playing d5 and getting the symmetrical center. One of their most popular other options is the Dutch defense here, playing f5. This stakes out some space in the center, and it also controls the valuable e4 square to stop white from grabbing the whole center. Of course, there's always a downside to moving your f-pawn in the opening. It's very dangerous to expose the king's short diagonal like that, but in the Dutch defense, black is willing to take that risk. There's also some unique move orders black can do here. For example, let's consider the move 1c5. This usually just transposes to a Benoni. For example, after d5, black will probably eventually play knight f6, and it's just as if black played knight f6 on move 1 and c5 on move 2, and it's a transposition. But they do have some unique ideas. For example, after d4, c5, d5, because black has not played knight f6 yet, sometimes black plays the move f5 here, making it harder for white to build that big center they usually get in the Benoni. Of course, very kind of double-edged, again exposing the king by moving this f-pawn. This is another rare option black has that often functions as a surprise weapon. Finally, there's a bunch of other moves black can play that are perfectly reasonable, but again, they don't really have much independent merit. They usually are going to transpose to something else. For example, let's say that black plays the move e6 against d4. Totally reasonable move, but black has to be ready to play all kinds of opening systems depending on what white does. White could play e4, for example, and now we're in an e4 opening. This is a French defense, just like after e4, e6, d4. So if black wants to play that move, they better know how to play the French defense against the king's pawn opening. Or if white doesn't want to switch to a king's pawn opening and they play a move like c4, well, now black is probably either going to have to play knight f6 at some point, which transposes to lines we've already seen. If they play d5, this is just a queen's gambit with a different move order. So hopefully this drives home the point one more time, how important these transpositions are to understanding queen's pawn openings. It's all about the specific setup and not about the specific move order you take to get there. Thank you very much, as always, for watching, everyone. And if you haven't already, make sure you go to chesspathways.com right now and get signed up. It takes only a couple seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking when you join our community. You'll also get to enter our contests, and I'll make sure you never miss out on any new content we make. Thanks!